Hello and welcome to the Cryptocurrency News Channel. This is going to be a continuation of yesterday's video about why China isn't really in the position and won't be for a while to overtake the US in much of anything. Maybe like overall GDP, but you have to look at like GDP per capita. But like in terms of like technology, like world dominance, it won't challenge the US in terms of reserve currency anytime soon. We're going to discuss why that is, and we're going to look at several factors. So the first thing is some people are saying the U.S. is decreasing in dominance, since like the 1950s. But of course, that was going to be the case because 1950s, right after World War II, you were basically comparing an industrialized U.S., which wasn't touched at all in World War II, except for Pearl Harbor, of course, to Europe, which was basically a pile of rubble being bombed to a pile of rubble, and Asia, which had also been overrun by the Japanese and in many parts being bombed to a pile of rubble. And obviously, there's no one in Antarctica. Africa's not developed. So, like, you really didn't have any competition besides Australia, but, like, they don't have that many people down there, and Australia was never really a threat to become a world giant superpower. Here's the thing. Unless like America had amazing leadership after the war and everyone else had incredibly incompetent leadership, America was never going to keep that position, because what it would take for America to keep that position in the 50s and 60s right after World War II was for the rest of the countries to say, you go ahead on America, we're going to stay a pile of rubble. Obviously, no one's going to do that. So as soon as other countries rebuilt their infrastructure and everything, America wasn't going to have the same incredibly dominant standing as right after World War II, because the other countries are no longer a pile of rubble and they can actually develop economically. So the thing about if you're comparing now with the 50s, that's not a valid comparison, because everyone else has built up their countries. They've had 70 years to rebuild and like redo their economy. It's a completely different world now. You can't expect the dominance we had in the 50s. That's just not possible. Let's actually talk about China specifically. First of all, if you look at the average salary in China, it's kind of misleading because they don't really count the countryside. It's very hard for them to gain the countryside because a lot of the people in the countryside, they don't necessarily get paid. They kind of just like live off kind of like what they make. And a lot of them come into the city and take very, very low paying jobs. They're called like farmers workers or rural workers. And they basically have like makeshift tents inside cities, and they get jobs and get paid very, very little for what they actually do. I don't think they really count them and average them in, because there's hundreds of millions of those people each year in every city. If you go into like Beijing or Nanjing, you can actually see a part of the city that's actually like dedicated to that. And many rural parts of China are incredibly poor. In those parts of China, if you can actually have enough rice to feed yourself and your family, you're good. My quality of life is quite a bit higher than that. So the actual, like when you look at average salary, a lot of times they don't count those things. And China has just announced that every single village they have is out of poverty. That's complete nonsense. Let me tell you what they do. Like they have some government officials actually go in and they have these certain numbers they want to hit. So essentially, like for people that don't hit that number, they basically dangle like a couple $1,000s in front of them, but they have to sign this contract saying, I am no longer in poverty. If you don't sign the contract, you don't get the money. You have to sign the contract to get the money. So obviously, like the people don't really care about the government reporting or if they're in poverty or not. They just want the money. So they sign the contract saying they're not in poverty, and lo and behold, the few hundred or thousands of dollars the government just gave them gets them out of the poverty bracket for like that month or that year. But after that year, they go back into poverty. So that's the way they can say like, you're no longer in poverty. They just have to meet that number for that month or that year that the government's watching that particular region. So they just have to meet the numbers. But realistically, a lot of the countryside still is in poverty, especially in provinces like Yunnan or like the outer provinces. So looking at like actually average salary in China, which is still much lower than the United States, is kind of misleading. You have to look at the GDP per capita, which is basically like the total GDP divided by the number of people between the United States and China. The GDP per capita in China is about $10,000 per year. The GDP in the United States is about $65,000 a year. So there is about a 6x difference in salary between the US and China. And this is going to be one of those reasons that China can't really switch from an export economy to a consumer economy anytime soon, because Chinese people just don't have the disposable income to actually hold that up. Now, you're saying, aren't things cheaper in China? Yes and no. housing's definitely not that cheap in China. Like if you think the property valuations in in New York and San Francisco are disastrous compared to someone's salary, the ones in Beijing, Shenzhen, and the major Chinese cities are way more disastrous. I think most people in China don't rent; they buy. And the thing is, like, an average person's salary would never be able to afford a house. When I say a house, I mean like not a nice house like the ones my parents have or the one a lot of other people have they buy. I mean a house. When they say a house in China, they generally mean a flat or an apartment, about maybe 1,000 square feet. That's kind of like the average family, and that's roughly equivalent to about 30 years of salary for most Chinese people. I mean, at least the Chinese people that are actually doing okay and they're making a decent amount of money. Most guys before they get married they have to have a house, and there's no way they can actually afford a house. So what the parents do is they save up for 30 years, and when their kid is about to get married, they actually buy the house for the kid because the kid can't actually afford it. And then like basically they spend like all of their salary, actually about half their salary each month, paying off that house. So your actual mortgage or rent takes up about around maybe like 40-50% of your total income. So like the average U.S. household income is gonna be $50,000-$60,000 between two parents. The average Chinese household income may be about $10,000, but things don't cost six times less. Like sure, if you buy like a few vegetables, maybe carrots are very cheap, but if you really look at other like higher status items like decent quality meat, like decent quality beef goes for maybe 40-50 yuan per pound, which is roughly eight like $7-8, which is fairly comparable to the U.S. Same thing for like pork. Chicken is a little cheaper, but like it's definitely not five times cheaper. So they're paying a much larger proportion of their salary towards food, and a much larger proportion of their salary towards housing. And the other thing is like consumer electronics and other facets of life like computers, phones, things that are necessary for our life today and necessary for a lot of people in urban China. They're not any cheaper in China than they are in the United States. I think iPhones actually cost more over there than over here. And many types of computers also are about the same price, if not more expensive, especially the brand name stuff. So the thing is like the cost of living in like China, in like a Chinese city, isn't like six times less than in an American city, but the cost of but you're making six times less. So what that means is that Chinese people have very little disposable income, and without disposable income, you can't have a consumer-driven economy. So until they can get that income per capita up, they're not really going to be able to have a consumer economy, and they're a couple of decades away from doing that. The other reason is like I've said before in the other video, you can't freely trade yuan, and they can't really just make a rule change that where they can, because no one really knows how much yuan's been printed. If you make that rule change, like all the big business people are going to try to trade yuan for U.S. dollars because they have no idea how much has been printed. Like I think most people know that there's a lot more Chinese yuan in circulation than US dollars. They've just been printing like crazy. Like with the USD, at least you know how much they print each year. Like we know that they printed about 40% of all USD in circulation this particular year. We went up from like 4 billion to above 6 billion. That's what we know. With Chinese yuan, they just keep printing, and no one really knows, besides the government, the high levels of government, how much they actually printed. So they know that if they take away that restriction, people are going to trade yuan for USD or euros like crazy, and their economy will be in danger. So they're not going to do that. That's why they banned all the cryptocurrency exchanges in the country. That's why you can't trade more than $50,000 a year in Chinese money for American money. So without a freely trading currency, you really can't take over the global market and become the reserve currency. That's just not really possible. The other thing is, like, to take over the world from a power level, you have to be able to do it both economically and militarily. And China is very, very high militarily. We have 12 Enterprise-class nuclear carriers for patrolling the world's oceans. China has two carriers. One of them's not really combat ever ready available because it's like an really old Soviet era carrier. And the other one is sort of combat, but it's not nuclear either. It's like conventional gas, which means its range is limited to like the South China Sea. It's basically try to establish regional dominance, but it can't really compete against any of the American carriers. The thing is, like, they're technologically on a military level and on a consumer electronics level Like they're way behind the United States. Like those carriers are using old Soviet era technology, whereas we're using fresh new technology. The thing is, you hear about China trying to spy US military secrets and US military technology and consumer technology all the time. But you never hear it the other way around. Like what like despite the whole thing like, oh, China has better 5G technology than us, then but Huawei was trying to like steal technology from the American companies. The American companies weren't trying to steal technology from Huawei. They're always like China's always trying to take technology from the United States and not the other way around. And it's not because the US is benevolent and doesn't want other people's military secrets and it's too kind-hearted to steal them. No, that's not the reason. We don't steal their technologies because they don't have anything we want. Like the thing is like they want the plans on how we make F-35 engines, F-22 engines because they don't know how to do that. We have no interest on how they make like Soviet era MiG engines because we know how to do that. We've known how to do that for 40 years. So the thing is, you can tell by that we don't really try to steal their military technology, but they try to steal ours. We don't try to steal their consumer electronics technology, but they try to steal ours. You can tell who's ahead of who. The thing is, like, if we were trying to steal like Huawei's technology, you could actually make the argument, yeah, they do have better 5G technology, but the problem is AT&T and Verizon aren't really trying to steal Huawei's technology. Huawei's trying to steal like American technology. You can tell that Huawei is actually behind in terms of technology compared to the American companies. And the same way you can tell that China's military is way behind the U.S. military in terms of technology. Obviously, like they don't have the Navy and Air Force that we do as well. So the thing is, like they're still kind of dependent on the U.S. So they like if the U.S. goes down, China's going to be in a lot of trouble because they have nowhere to have their exports. And because they can't really convert to a consumer economy because people don't have any disposable cash to support that consumer economy in China, the Chinese economy would really, really take an extremely hard hit if the American economy went down. They're not going to become like the world reserve currency because you can't trade their currency freely on the open market. There's no way they can change that in the short run, and they're way behind militarily. So while they might be a big regional power in in the Asian region, by the way, if we actually let Japan build their military, and then they actually wanted to, which the people actually don't. Japan has the capacity to easily surpass China in military power because they actually have the technology. And once you have the technology, everything else is just construction. And I bet they could actually do it. The Japanese people just don't want to have that expenditure, that military expenditure, added on to their already increasing expenditures. But the thing is, like, China is just going to become like a regional power in the region. Like in the next 20 years, I really don't think they can actually challenge. They can't really challenge the U.S. in terms of like real economic or real military power. And in the next 20 years, I don't think they can actually afford to have America kind of like go down in flames. Like the really nationalistic people might say it, but realistically, the leaders know differently because if you don't have an export market, if your main export market goes down, a lot of your people are going to be unemployed. And you could try to fill the volume by telling Chinese people to buy more, but oh wait, they don't have any money to buy any more stuff. So you're going to have a very, very big problem. So those are the reasons why the US will actually remain the biggest power in the world for at least the next 20-25 years. Now, we're not going to our dominance might decrease as the rest of the world comes catching up, but no one's actually going to pass us in terms of power in that period of time. And just like, our dominance has been like slowly decreasing ever since the 1950s. Like I said, everyone else is rebuilding. They didn't stay a pile of rubble. So you can't really continue to expect post World War II dominance. That's more of a natural flow. But I don't really think this whole fear of China taking over the US's position in the next 20-25 years is really going to come true. After 20 to 25 years, like when you get into like 2050 and beyond, then it's very, very hard to tell. But at this point, I really wouldn't be worried about the Chinese yuan being the reserve currency or China being the predominant military power in the world because they are still very far behind. So that is the news for today. Let me know what you think. Like and subscribe. Hit that bell notifications button. Thank you and have a nice day.